Hi, Stephen from Owner Disown. Recently I did a video comparing the 1660 Ti against the GTX 1060, with the 1060 being cheaper and the 1660 Ti ended up being about 24% faster. If you haven't seen that video, certainly click up here. But this time I'm comparing the GTX 1060 against the GTX 1650. Now, price-wise, they're pretty evenly matched. For example, the Asus TOF FX504, which I'd mentioned before, with the i5-8300H and the 1060, is about $809. Whilst the Acer Nitro 5, with an i5-9300H and a 1650 is around about $830 new, or you can get refurbished models for as low as $680 with a 90-day warranty. And of course you can also get, for example, like the MSI GL63 with a 6-core CPU 8750H and the 1650 for as low as $800. So that is great. So a very similar price. So let's see how they perform across 5 games. So for the GTX 1650, I'm running the Acer Nitro 5 17-inch model, 16GB of RAM running dual channel, and the i5-9300H CPU. I also overclocked the GPU by 147 MHz. And in the GTX 1060 corner is the Aorus X3 V7 with an i7-7820HK CPU clocked at 4 GHz and also 2 sticks of 8GB RAM. And this time I overclocked the GPU by 182 MHz, which is the best I could get for this GPU. So first up, we've got Far Cry 5 using the inbuilt benchmark at 1080p ultra settings, the GTX 1650 on the left and the GTX 1060 on the right. And it does seem that the 1060 has a slight advantage here, and if you want to game at this settings at this resolution above 60 FPS, it looks like the 1060 is the way to go. So now testing both with the GPU overclocked, and I must admit in Far Cry 5 this generally doesn't yield that much, but let's see if an overclocked GTX 1650 will match a stock clocked GTX 1060. So here we have the 1650 at the top and the 1060 at the bottom. In orange we have the average FPS at stock clocks, and in green we have the overclock settings, and it looks like the 1060 has a 10% advantage here. Now we turn to Battlefield 5 1080p DX11 using the stock clocks, the 1650 on the left, the 1060 on the right. And this time I would say they're a little bit closer for sure, possibly because the 1650's 9300H is holding a 4 GHz better than the 7820 in this 1060 laptop. But that being said, let's see how the overclock settings get on. Now with both GPUs overclocked, and of course I'm playing a full 64-player multiplayer map here. It's a Conquest map, and I always using the Rotterdam map as the test. And it looks like the GTX 1060 is actually pulled ahead a bit here when it's overclocked. And of course it is being overclocked a little bit further than the 1650. And indeed, at stock clocks, both the 1650 and the 1060 were about the same at about 63 FPS. Now they overclocked the 1060 and that increased it by about 10%, whilst the 1650 stayed much the same. So here we have Rainbow Six Siege 1080p ultra settings, 1650 on the left and the 1060 on the right. And to be fair, they are very close in most scenes. Now what I did notice is that when the scenes are darker, the GTX 1060 does pull ahead quite a bit. So that is certainly interesting. So let's see what it's like when it's overclocked. So now with both GPUs overclocked, we see much the same. The 1060 again performing better than the 1650 in the darker scenes, and in the lighter scenes again being quite similar. I would say the 1650 and the 1060 do both improve the overclocking in this game. Perhaps the 1060 even more so due to that higher overclock. So it's interesting to see at stock clocks there's only about a 3% difference between the two cards, but when overclocked the 1060 pulls ahead by about 7%. It's also good to see here that the overclocked 1650 corresponds to the stock clocked GTX 1060. Now on to Overwatch using Epic settings, and again the stock clocks on the GPU. Of course, playing a full multiplayer game here, and we see that the GTX 1060 it outperforms at 1650 by quite a wide margin here. I don't quite understand why, but it certainly is. And if you play this game a lot, I think the 1060 is a good option for you. Let's have a look at how they overclock. Okay, so now Overwatch with epic settings with both GPUs overclocked, playing the multiplayer game again. Now there's no inbuilt benchmark here, so I prefer to do it this way rather than say a target range to give an accurate representation of what you would see when you're playing a multiplayer game in here. And I use fraps to record the frame rate. Every time I die, I stop recording and start again when I spawn again in the action. And of course I might have about 10 to 15 different readings and I average it out. So the GTX 1060 does overclock really well and it gets a good performance, and it's certainly better than the 1650. So yeah, the GTX 1060 enjoys about a 25% increase in performance over the 1650 here, pushing it above the 100 FPS mark. So the final game is Shadow of the Tomb Raider using higher settings, again at stock clocks, 1650 on the left, GTX 1060 on the right. And the GTX 1060 certainly does have the upper hand on the 1650. Not at the same margin as Overwatch, but it's certainly there, probably around about 15% or so. So let's see how it is when it gets overclocked. So now with both GPUs overclocked, now both do improve when you overclock it, but the GTX 1060 maintains its percentage improvement over the GTX 1650. So let's say if overclocking the 1650 nearly brings it on par to the stock 1060. So at both stock clocks and overclocked, the 1060 is about 15% faster than the GTX 1650. However, when you do overclock the 1650, it's within 8% of the stock clock 1060, which isn't too bad. So here we have it, averaging all 5 games, giving an average FPS, and the stock GTX 1060 is 10% faster than the stock 1650. Overclock both GPUs, the overclock 1060 is 14% faster, and if you compare this overclocked GTX 1650 versus a stock clocked 1060, the 1060 is still 6% faster. Now looking from a value for money perspective, you may want to consider the GTX 1650 if it's about $80 to $100 less than the 1060. But one plus point it does have going for it, it is a 50 watt part versus an 80 watt part on the 1060. So it will run cooler and you might find it in more slimmer chassis. Anyway, hope you found that useful. Remember, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.